From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. The Old Brown Witch. Several years ago we had, in the golf club at Cambridge, a Russian prince who took up golf and the questions of spirits, bogies, witches, banshees, death warnings, and the like equally strongly. He was a firm believer in all of them, and belonged to a phantasmalogical research society to inquire into and expose all such things. I frequently have long letters from him from all sorts of remote parts of the world, where he is investigating tales of haunted houses, churchyards, and so on. But from this his last letter he seems to have contrived to meet a genuine and very unpleasant sort of spectre. Of course, I suppress all names. February 1905. Dear W.T.L., well, here I am, actually, in a really haunted manor house at last. And I've had a most horribly weird and uncanny experience of a most loathsome appearance. I've been here a fortnight now. Such a queer, great old house, all turrets and towers and damp wings covered with ivy and creepers, and such small, narrow windows. It is on a slight elevation, and has, in bygone days, has a moat all around it. It is surrounded by dense woods, and there is a black-looking lake at the back. The staircases are all stone and very narrow, and there is an old chapel and a coffin room in the house. In the garden, in a yew avenue, is a vault and a tombstone, and thereby hangs my curious tale. It seems that centuries ago a very unpleasant old widow lady and a very unpleasant son had the old house. She was a very ugly and eccentric creature and a miser, and was nicknamed by the village folk the Brown Witch. The tales about her ongoings told to this day are most remarkable. It seems her son, who according to all accounts was a shocking bad lot, was killed in a duel, and the old lady died shortly afterwards, a raving maniac. She seems to have left a very curious will. I deal with only two details in it. One was that the chamber in which she lived and died was forever to be left untouched and undisturbed, but unlocked, or the disturber would be cursed with instant blindness and ultimately death. The second was that she was to be buried in the vault in the yew avenue that she had specifically made for her remains, that she was to be dressed in her usual clothes and bonnet, and that she must be placed in a tightly sealed glass coffin, so as to be visible to any intruder. My host told me the chamber on the vault in the grounds has never been interfered with, but that her appearances had been very frequent to most credible witnesses, and that such appearances all portended some dire calamity to come on. She had appeared and terrified many visitors, both in the house and in the grounds. She had also been seen by the village pastor and by the servants. He had never seen her himself, but he had taken every measure he could think of to unravel the mystery, but in vain. The outdoor servants were terrified, and would never remain, and one lady visitor had nearly been driven mad by seeing her peering in at the window at dusk. Of course, I laughed the tale to scorn, and also the story of the alarm bell, which tolled at intervals without any apparent or human agency. Not even the bravest would dare to walk down the yew avenue after nightfall. Well, I had been 10 days in the house before anything happened. I must say, the wind and the rats and the owls and bats and the tapping noise of the ivy on the old windows at night were rather creepy, but nothing really out of the common happened till the other night. My room was in a long, narrow, old gallery. After cards and billiards, and at about 12:30, I was going off to my well-earned rest and was getting near my door in the gallery, when I saw a faint light coming towards me round a corner. I went into my room and waited to see who was wandering about so late at night. Then a figure stopped at my door, evidently carrying a lighted old lantern. I raised my candle to have an inspection, and then, oh horror, I staggered back for a moment, for before me clearly stood the horrible figure of the old brown witch. A cold sweat broke out all over me. Far, far worse than the description. I saw her brown robe and the poke bonnet, the horrible face, the huge black sockets of the eyes without eyeballs, the nose gone, and worst of all, that fearful grin, the cruel grin of a maniac, a wicked, terrible face. I opened my drawer and seized my always loaded revolver. I shouted loudly and fired once, twice, thrice. She never moved. Only the horrible mocking smile grew wider and more devilish. I rushed forward, slammed my door to shut out the awful sight, and then collapsed back into a chair. I must have hit it each time for certain. An offensive charnel house smell pervaded the air. Then the door flew open, and my host and several men and servants rushed into the room, anxiously asking what was the matter and why I fired. I told them everything. We found the 3 bullet shots in the wall opposite my door. They must have passed through that abominable horror. Need I say I spent a wretched night? In fact, I sat up and never went to bed at all. I resolved to leave next day early, but before doing that I determined at all hazards to go into that vault and see what it contained, and also to carefully investigate the Brown's Witch chamber without disturbing anything in it. I told my host next day at breakfast what I proposed doing, and he offered no objection whatever. But he declined absolutely to go near the vault or chamber himself, or to let any of his household do so. "Oh, by the by, did you ring the alarm bell in the tower last night?" he asked me. "It was the sound of your shots, and the great bell ringing immediately afterwards, that brought me along so quickly to your room. We all heard it." I told him I knew nothing of it, and never even heard the bell. "I thought that," he said, "for you were nearly off in a faint when we all came in and hardly knew us for a bit." "I can't make out the bell," said my host, "or what on earth can make it ring so. It has no rope, and it cannot possibly be the wind. I must have it removed. Last time it rung loudly like that, my old housekeeper was found dead in her bed in the morning." To make a long story short, the next thing I did was to get a couple of laborers to shovel away the earth and find the lid of the old vault in the yew avenue. This was soon done, and we quickly descended into the place with lights. We found ourselves in a large built, clammy chamber, and on the floor lay a tattered and broken old lantern. At first we thought the chamber was empty, but all of a sudden we noticed a niche at one end, and at once went forward to it. In this singular alcove was a large glass box or coffin standing on its end, and in it, and standing upright, was the horrible eyeless mummy, still arrayed in the brown robe and poke bonnet of the terrible creature I had seen in the gallery, and with the same mocking, grinning mouth and the huge, ugly teeth. The same smell I have told you of before pervaded the whole place. She was hermetically sealed up in this ghastly coffin and preserved. We were all very glad to leave that charnel house and cover it up out of sight, but not out of memory. That would be perfectly impossible to any of us. I can't get that smell out of my nose yet. It would sicken you. Next, I went to the chamber with a friend and my bicycle lantern to investigate. It was a long, narrow stone stair. The old oak door, it was unlocked, as I said before, soon yielded to our combined efforts and creaked open, and we stood in a room of the Middle Ages. The old shutters were tightly closed. The ceiling, which had once been handsomely painted, was rapidly filling away, and the tapestry was rotting off the walls. It had evidently once been a splendid apartment. It now was given up to rats and moths and spiders and damp. It chilled one to the very marrow, and it had that same horrible smell. There was a four-poster bed in one corner, with rags and shreds of curtains, probably where the old creature had died. The tables and lyra were covered with the dust of ages. There was no carpet of any kind. An old spinet stood against the wall, and papers were lying all over the place, inches deep in dust. A few charred logs of wood lay in the gaping old fireplace, with its old-time chimney corners, and there seemed to be bits of valuable old china and bric-a-brac about the place. Many pictures had fallen off the walls, but a few faded pencil drawings were still in their place. Just guess my surprise and astonishment when I found they were Scottish views, one of Edinburgh, one of Crail Church, and three of St. Andrews, including the old college and chapel, the castle, and St. Leonard's College, which dates 1676. Here was another most curious thing I determined to ask about before I left. However, I touched nothing in the room, as I had promised my host, and besides, you will laugh, I had no wish to be stricken with the brown witch's promised curse of blindness and ultimate death to any intruder who touched her things. I dreaded her far too much since I had seen her in the gallery and in her tomb, and heard of her bewitched alarm bell, which portended death to someone. Before I left, I mentioned the Scottish drawings in the witch's room to my host, and asked him if he could throw any light on how they came to be there. Briefly, it seems that she, the witch, sent her son far away in those old days to Scottish University, and St. Andrews was her choice. It seems he was very quarrelsome in his cups, and frequently fought duels, and generally proved the victor. One of the last he fought at Salchopstone, near Crail, with a nephew Laird of Balcombe Castle, and they fought, was broadsword and buckler, and again the witch's son killed his man. His last duel was fought on St. Andrew's Sands, with rapiers, and he was run through the heart. A good job. Now, I must conclude. I am determined to investigate further the whole most mysterious affair. If you ever visit this place, my host, Mr. X says he will let you explore the vault in the Yew Avenue and see the coffin and the old witch, and you may also go and look at the chamber. If you ever do, take the advice of an old friend and do not dare to touch anything therein. Your friend to command. The apparition of the Prior of Pittenweem. It was in September 1875 that I first met dear old Captain Chester, now gone to his rest, and it was very many years before that date that he rented his fearsomely haunted old house in St. Andrews. I was a Cambridge boy when I met him. How the undergraduates scorned that term, boy. He told me the following queer tales in the Poppledorf Avenue at Bonn when I was on holiday. The house he rented at St. Andrews, from his accounts, must have been a most unpleasant and eerie dwelling. Rappings and hammerings were heard all over the house after nightfall, trembling of the walls, quiverings, heavy falls, and ear-piercing shrieks were also part of the nightly program. I suggested bats, rats, owls, and smugglers as the cause, which made the old man perfectly wild with rage and caused him to use most unparliamentary language. I pointed out that such language would probably have soared away any respectable ghost. However, let me tell the story in his own peculiar way. My brother and I took the house, sir, he said, and we had a nephew and some nieces with us. There were also 3 middle-aged English servants at the time, and gadsooth, sir, they had strange names. The cook possessed the extraordinary name of Maria Trombone. The housemaid was called Jemima Podge, and the other old cat was called Teresa Shadbolt. One evening I was sitting smoking in my study when the door flew open with a bang, and Maria rushed in. "Zounds, Mrs. Trombone," I said, "how dare you come into my room like this?" "Well, sir," she said, "there awful things going on tonight. I'm frightened to death. I was washing up, sir, when something rushed past me with a rustle, and I got a great smack on the cheek with a damp cold hand. And then the place shook, and all the things clattered like anything. Nonsense, Trombone, I said. You were asleep. Or have you been drinking? Lord bless you, sir, no, never a drop. But last night, Sir Teresa Shadbolt had all the bedclothes pulled off her bed twice, sir, and Jane said a tall old man in a queer dressing gown came into her room and brushed his white beard over her face. And Lord, sir, didn't you hear us screaming? No, I'm hanged if I did. You must all be stark staring mad, you know. Not a bit of us, master, continued Mrs. Trombone. There is something wrong about this blessed house. Locked doors and windows fly wide open, and the bells keep ringing at all hours of the night. And we hear steps on the stairs when everyone is in bed, and knocks, and crashes, and screams. Then the tables and things go moving about. No Christian could put up with it, please, sir. We must all leave. Well, I got all those women up, and they told me deuced queer things, but I squared them up at last. How? I inquired. I doubled their wages, sir, and I told them they might all sleep in one room upstairs together, and I promised them a real good blow-out at Christmas, and so on. Next, my nephew and little nieces saw the old man with a long white beard at various times in the passages and on the stairs. Oddly enough, my little nieces got quite accustomed to see the aged man with a grey beard, and were not a bit timid. They said he was just like the picture of Old Father Christmas, and he looked land. I never saw him, continued Chester, till one All-Hallows night, or Halloween, as they term it in St. Andrews. But I will speak of that later on. Go on, I said. It is very interesting indeed to me. The servants all saw him at times, and that old arch-fiend Trombone was constantly getting frightened and breaking things and fainting. I was myself annoyed by strange unearthly sounds. When sitting smoking at night late, there were curious rollings and rumblings under the house, like enormous stone balls being bowled along, then a heavy thud, followed by an intolerable silence. Then there was a curious sound like muffled blinds being quickly drawn up and down. That and a sort of flapping and rustling seemed to pervade the air. This perplexed me, and I got in a detective, but he found out nothing at all. After much trouble and research, I learned of the legend of the Prior of Pittenweem and his connection with the old house. It seems, when Moray and his gang of plunderers shut up at St. Monant's church in the old priory of Pittenweem, the last prior, not foreman or rouse, a very old man, was cut adrift, and for some months lay hidden at Newark Castle, food being brought him by some former monks. Newark Castle was burned, and this old prior fled to Balcombe Castle. From there he went to Kinkell Cave, near St. Andrews. I know all those places well, I said. After some weeks, and when winter came, he took refuge in the very old house in which I lived. He seems to have been among both friends and foes there, and brawls were quite common things within those walls. One night, those long dead and forgotten old world inhabitants were startled from their slumbers by shots, the clashing of arms, and wild yells. To make a long tale short, that old prior of Pittenweem was never seen by human eyes after that fearful night. Many suspected foul play, but in those times it was deemed best to keep one's mouth shut tight, and what mattered if an old prior disappeared? They were awful times, those, I said. Glad we live in those days. Well now, said the captain, I must come to the night of All Hallows Eve, or Holy Even, when the spirits of the night are said to wander abroad. We dined early in those days, and after dinner I walked down to the old clubhouse and golf place, of which I was an honorary member, to play cards. It was a perfect night, and a few flakes of snow had begun to fall, and the wind was keen and sharp. When I left the club later, the ground was well covered with snow, but the storm had ceased, and the moon and stars were shining bright in a clear sky. By Jove, sir, it was like fairyland, and all the church towers and housetops were glittering in the moonbeams. I wandered about the old place for fully an hour. It was lovely. I was reluctant to go indoors. Gad, sir, I got quite sad and poetical. I thought of my poor sister who died long ago and is buried in Stefano Rotondo at Rome, and lots of other things. Then I thought of St. Andrew's, as it is and what it might have been. I thought of all its holy temples erected by our pious forefathers, and its altars and statues lying desolate, ruined, and profaned. At last, I arrived at my own door and entered, in a thoughtful mood. I went to my study and put on my slippers and dressing gown. I had just sat down and commenced reading, when there came a most tremendous shivering crash. I involuntarily cowered down. I thought the roof had fallen. At least, gad, sir, I was flabbergasted. It woke everyone. The crash was followed by a roaring sound. It must have been an earthquake, Captain Chester, I said. Zounds, sir, I don't know what it was. I thought I was killed. Then my nephew and I got a lamp and examined the house. Everything was right. Nothing to account for the fearful noise. Finally, we went downstairs to the vaulted kitchen. Zounds, sir, all of a sudden my nephew gripped my arm and with a cry of abject terror pointed to the open kitchen door. "Oh, look there," he almost screamed. I looked, and gad, I got a queer turn. There facing us in the open doorway was a very tall, shaven-headed old man with a long grey beard. He had a white robe or cassock on a linen rocket, and above all an almost or cloak of black hue lined with ermine. The Augustinian habit. In one hand he had a very large rosary, and he leant on a stout cudgel. As I advanced, he retreated backwards, always beckoning to me, and I followed, lamp in hand. I had to follow, could not help myself. Do you know the way a serpent can fascinate or hypnotize its prey before it devours them? Yes, I said. I've seen the snakes at the zoo do that trick. Well, sir, I was hypnotized like that, precisely like that. He beckoned, and I followed. Suddenly, I saw a little door in the corner of the kitchen standing open, a door I had never noticed before. The shadowy vision backed towards it. Still I followed. Then he entered its portals. As I advanced, he grew more and more transparent, and finally melted away, and the heavy door shut upon him with a tremendous crash and rattle. The lamp fell from my trembling hand and was shattered to fragments on the stone floor. I was in pitch darkness. Silence reigned. I don't remember how I got out to light it again. Next morning, I got in some workmen and took them down to the kitchen, direct to the corner where the door was through which the apparition vanished the previous night. Zounds, sir, there was no door there, only the white plastered wall. I was dumbfounded. "Mrs. Trombone," I said to the cook, "where the devil is that door gone?" "The door, sir," said the cook. "There ain't no door there that I ever saw." "Trombone," I replied, "don't tell falsehoods. You're a fool." I made the men set to work and tear down the plaster and stuff, and egad, sir, in an hour we found the door. A thick oak, nail-studded, iron-clamped old door. It took some time to force it open, and then down 3 steps we found ourselves in a chamber with mighty thick walls and with a flagged floor, about 6 feet square, lit by a small slit of a window. "Tear up the flags," I said. They did so, and there was only earth below. "Dig down," I said. "Dig like thunder." In about an hour we came to a huge flag with a ring in it. Up it came, and below it was a dryly built, bottle-shaped well. We went down with lights. What do you think we found at the bottom of it? "Perhaps water," I suggested. "Water be damned," said Captain Chester. We found the mouldering skeleton of a very tall man in a sitting posture. Beside him lay a large rosary and a stout oak cudgel. The rosary and cudgel I had seen in the phantom's hand the previous night. My friend, I had solved the problem. That was the skeleton of the old prior of Pittenweem, who vanished in that house hundreds of years ago.